Cathral Vaughn stood on the observation deck of the carrier ship Dominant Will and watched the blue planet grow larger in the viewport. Its swirling white clouds and green continents looking peaceful and soft and completely unaware of what was coming. He had seen this moment 400 times before with 400 different worlds. And it always ended the same way. With surrender and submission and the quiet acceptance of hegemony rule, the humans would be no different. That was what High Commander Desik had told the assembled officers just hours ago, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of 10,000 years of conquest. And Cathral had believed every word, because why would he not believe it when the evidence of hegemony, superiority surrounded him in the form of a fleet so vast it blocked out the stars? They are primitives, Desik had declared, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of contempt. They have barely left their own moon, and they spend most of their energy fighting each other over resources they could easily share. And their weapons are chemical and crude, and their shields are non-existent. And we will crush them before their sun sets twice. The officers had laughed at this, a rippling sound of confidence that filled the great hall. And Cathral had laughed with them because he was young and ambitious and eager to add another conquered world to his service record. Now he watched the first wave of landing craft descend through the atmosphere like burning arrows, their plasma trails cutting bright lines across the blue sky. And he felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job about to be completed. The initial reports came quickly, and they were everything High Command had predicted. Major population centers struck with precision bombardment. Military installations neutralized within minutes. Communication networks disrupted and government buildings reduced to rubble. And the human defenders scattered like insects fleeing a fire. Cathral monitored the feeds from his station, watching footage of human soldiers running through burning streets, their primitive projectile weapons useless against hegemony armor, their desperate radio calls going unanswered as their command structure collapsed around them. It was almost too easy, by the end of the first day, that hegemony controlled every major city on the largest continent, and occupation forces were already establishing command posts and processing centers. And Cathral began drafting his report on the successful completion of Phase 1. Then something strange happened. The surrender protocols did not come in every other conquest Cathral had witnessed or studied. This was the moment when the defeated species sent their leaders to negotiate terms, to beg for mercy, to accept whatever conditions the hegemony demanded in exchange for their survival. But the human leaders did not come. Instead, there was silence, broken only by scattered reports of minor resistance that made no tactical sense. Small groups of humans attacking supply convoys and disappearing into the ruins. Individual soldiers who fought to the death rather than accept capture. Civilians who threw rocks and bottles at armored vehicles knowing full well they could not win. Cathral dismissed these incidents as the death throes of a broken species, the random twitching of a body that did not yet know it was dead. But the incidents did not stop. On the third day, a report came in that made Cathral pause over his console, his long fingers hovering above the keys as he read the words again to make sure he had understood them correctly. A single human soldier, wounded so badly that he should not have been able to move, had dragged himself 3 kilometers through occupied territory, leaving a trail of blood that the patrol drones somehow missed, and had detonated a thermal charge beneath the hegemony command post, killing himself and 47 hegemony officers in an explosion that lit up the night sky. Cathral stared at the report for a long time. He tried to understand what would drive a dying creature to spend its last hours crawling through mud and rubble just to kill enemies who had already won. And he could not find an answer that made sense within the framework of logic he had been taught. He brought the incident to his superior officer, a veteran named Dreth, who had overseen a dozen conquests and Dreth barely glanced at the report before waving it away. Desperation, Dreth said. It happens sometimes with the more primitive species. They do not understand that the war is over, and they waste their lives in pointless gestures of defiance. And it means nothing because one soldier cannot change the outcome of a conquest. Kethral nodded and returned to his station. But he could not shake the image of that wounded human, dragging himself through the darkness with a bomb strapped to his chest and death already claiming his body. What kind of species produced individuals like that? The question stayed with him through the following days as more reports came in, each one stranger than the last. A human female who worked in a food processing facility had poisoned an entire shipment of rations destined for hegemony troops, killing herself in the process. When she was discovered, but not before the tainted food had claimed 200 lives, a group of human children, none older than 10 solar cycles, had been caught smuggling weapons and intelligence through a network of tunnels beneath a conquered city. And when they were cornered, they had fought back with knives and rocks in their bare hands until every single one of them was dead. An elderly human male had walked into a Gemini checkpoint with explosives hidden beneath his clothing and had embraced the commanding officer before detonating himself. These were not soldiers. These were not trained warriors following orders. These were farmers and children and old people who should have been grateful that the war was over and their lives had been spared. And instead, they were throwing those lives away in acts of violence that could not possibly change anything. Kethral began to feel something he had never felt in all his years of service. Something cold and uncomfortable that settled in his chest and would not go away. It was the first whisper of doubt. On the 10th day, the communications division intercepted a transmission that was being broadcast across all human frequencies. A message that seemed to be meant for every human on the planet. Kethral was there when it was translated, standing in the back of the intelligence center as the words appeared on the main screen. The message was short. It said, "They think they have won, but they do not know us. They do not understand what we are or what we are capable of. And we will show them. We will teach them. We will make them remember this world for the rest of their history as the place where they learned that humanity does not kneel." The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone laughed. A nervous sound that tried to be dismissive, but failed. The message ended with 5 words that Kethral would remember for the rest of his life. "We are just getting started." 8 months had passed since the invasion began, and Kethral no longer recognized the war he was fighting. By every measure that mattered to High Command, the conquest was complete. The human governments had fallen, and their armies had been destroyed, and their cities were under hegemony control. And the reports that went back to the homeworld spoke of victory and successful occupation, and the addition of another species to the empire. But Kethral knew the reports were lies. He knew because he walked the streets of the occupied territories every day, and he saw the truth in the eyes of every human he passed. That burning look of hatred and patience, and something else that he could not name but that made his skin crawl beneath his armor. The humans had not surrendered. They had simply changed the way they fought. Kethral had been reassigned to what High Command called pacification duties, which was a polite way of saying that his job was to hunt down resistance fighters and make examples of anyone who refused to accept hegemony rule. It was supposed to be easy work, the kind of assignment given to mid-ranking officers who needed to fill time between real battles. But Kethral quickly learned that there was nothing easy about occupying a human world. The resistance was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A farmer would spend weeks tending crops that were destined for hegemony supply depots, and then on the night before harvest, he would burn his entire field to the ground and vanish into the wilderness. And when patrols went looking for him, they would find only empty forests and abandoned shelters, and sometimes the bodies of soldiers. who had wandered too far from their units, engineers who had been forced to work in hegemony manufacturing facilities, would sabotage equipment in ways so subtle that the damage would not be discovered until weeks later when critical systems failed at the worst possible moments. Doctors and healers who treated hegemony wounded during the day would slip out night to plant explosives on supply routes and patrol paths, and they would return before dawn with clean hands and tired eyes and no evidence of what they had done. Kethro began to understand that he was not fighting an army. He was fighting an entire species. The realization came to him fully on the day his unit was sent to secure a small village in the Northern Territories, a place of perhaps 200 humans that intelligence had identified as a resistance hub. They arrived expecting to find a frightened population that would cooperate in exchange for their lives. The way conquered peoples always did. The way they were supposed to do according to everything Kethro had been taught about the nature of war. Instead, they found empty houses and silent streets and not a single human in sight. The village had been evacuated, but that was not what made Kethro stop in the middle of the main road and stare at what surrounded him. Beneath every house there were tunnels, carefully constructed passages that connected the entire village in an underground network that stretched for kilometers in every direction. There were hidden rooms filled with weapons and supplies and medical equipment. There were escape routes that led to the mountains and the forests and other villages that had their own tunnel systems. There were communication devices that used frequencies the hegemony had never thought to monitor. The humans had known the hegemony was coming. They had known for weeks, perhaps months, and instead of running or surrendering, they had prepared. They had planned. They had built an entire hidden infrastructure right beneath the feet of their conquerors, and they had waited for the right moment to disappear. Kethro stood in one of those tunnels with his weapon hanging loose at his side, and he felt something he had never felt before in his career as a soldier of the hegemony. He felt outmatched. The interrogation of the resistance leader happened 3 days later. She was an elderly human female, captured when her escape route collapsed during a hegemony bombing run, and she had been brought to the regional command center for questioning. Kethro was assigned to conduct the interrogation because his superiors believed he had a talent for getting information from reluctant prisoners, and he entered the room expecting to find a broken creature who would tell him everything he wanted to know in exchange for mercy. The woman who looked back at him from across the table was not broken. She was thin and bruised, and one of her arms hung at an angle that suggested it had been damaged during her capture. But her eyes were steady and calm, and when she smiled at him, there was no fear in it. "You are the one they call Kethro," she said. "I have heard stories about you from the ones you have questioned before. They say you are not as cruel as the others, that you try to understand us instead of just hurting us until we talk." Kethro sat down across from her and studied her face, looking for weakness, looking for the cracks that would let him break her open and spill her secrets. He found nothing. "I want to know about your network," he said. "I want to know how many villages are connected to your tunnels, and where your weapons come from, and who leads your resistance." The woman laughed. It was not a bitter laugh or a desperate laugh, but a genuine sound of amusement that filled the small room and made Kethro's scales itch with discomfort. "You do not understand what you have done," she said. "You came to our world expecting to find a species like all the others you have conquered, divided and weak and ready to submit to anyone strong enough to demand it." She leaned forward and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away. "But we are not like the others," she continued. "We have spent our entire history fighting each other, killing each other, destroying ourselves in wars over land and resources and ideas. And we have never stopped, not once in 10,000 years of civilization." Her smile widened. "And then you came, and you gave us something we have never had before, something we could not have created for ourselves no matter how hard we tried." "What did we give you?" Kethro asked, and he hated how small his voice sounded. "You gave us a common enemy." The woman said, "You gave us something to agree on. You gave us a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting together. And now you will learn what humans are truly capable of when we are not busy destroying ourselves." She sat back in her chair, and the smile faded into something harder and colder. "Every human on this planet is your enemy now," she said. "Every farmer and doctor and child and elder. Every person you pass on the street and every worker in your factories and every prisoner in your camps. We are all fighting you in ways you cannot see and cannot stop." Catherall left the interrogation room without getting a single piece of useful information. That night he sat in his quarters and accessed the archives, pulling up everything the hegemony had collected about human history. And he began to read. What he found kept him awake until dawn. This species had survived ice ages that froze their entire world, plagues that killed half their population, wars that destroyed their greatest cities, and disasters both natural and self-inflicted that should have ended them 100 times over. And every single time they had refused to die. Every single time they had crawled out of the ashes and rebuilt, and grown stronger, and kept going. Catherall closed the archive and stared at the wall of his quarters and felt the cold certainty of what he had to do settle into his bones. He spent the next 3 days writing a classified report that recommended immediate and complete withdrawal from the human world. He explained that the conquest could not be completed, that the humans would never stop fighting, that the cost of occupation would eventually exceed any benefit the hegemony could gain from controlling this species. He submitted the report through proper channels and waited. The response came 1 week later. His recommendation was rejected. High Command believed that victory was imminent and that increased force would break the human resistance within the next solar cycle. Catherall read the response and deleted it and said nothing to anyone. But he knew the truth. The hegemony had made a terrible mistake coming to this world, and they were only beginning to understand what that mistake would cost them. 2 years into the war, and Catherall barely recognized the enemy. He was fighting the humans who had once faced hegemony soldiers with primitive projectile weapons and desperate courage now carried plasma rifles that glowed with the same deadly light as hegemony's standard issue. But when Catherall examined the captured weapon, he found that it was not simply a copy. It was better. The humans had taken hegemony technology apart piece by piece and studied every component and figured out not just how it worked, but how it could be improved. And then they had built their own versions using materials available on their world and modifications suited to their environment. The plasma rifles had been adjusted to function more efficiently in Earth's atmosphere. The power cells lasted 3 times longer than hegemony standard. The targeting systems had been simplified so that any human soldier could use them effectively with minimal training. And this was not the only example across the planet. The resistance had turned the hegemony's own weapons against them. Shield generators powered by rivers and waterfalls. Communication devices that used the humans' own satellite network to coordinate attacks across continents. Armor plating forged from alien alloys and shaped to fit human bodies. The conquest that was supposed to take 2 solar cycles had become a war that showed no signs of ending. Catherall had been promoted twice during this time, not because of any great success, but because so many officers above him had died. And now he commanded a battalion that patrolled the eastern territories where the resistance was strongest. It was during one of these patrols that everything changed. His unit was moving through a forest that intelligence had identified as a supply route for resistance fighters. When the attack came, silent and sudden and devastating in a way that spoke of careful planning and perfect execution. Plasma fire erupted from the trees on all sides. Catherall's soldiers fell around him, their shields overwhelmed by coordinated strikes that hit the same spots, again and again until the protective fields collapsed. He saw his second-in-command take a shot to the chest and crumple without a sound. He saw young soldiers who had been laughing just moments ago lying, still on the forest floor with smoke rising from their wounds. He fired blindly into the trees and tried to rally his surviving troops, but there was no one left to rally. Just bodies and silence and the soft sound of human boots moving through the underbrush when the humans emerged from the forest. Kethrol expected to die. He had seen what resistance fighters did to captured hegemony soldiers. Or rather, he had heard the stories, tales of torture and mutilation and slow, painful deaths designed to send a message to other would-be conquerors. He dropped his weapon and stood straight and waited for the end, but the end did not come. Instead, a human male approached him with a medical kit and began treating a wound on Kethrol's arm that he had not even noticed he had received. "You are wondering why we are not killing you," the human said. And his voice was calm and almost gentle in a way that made Kethrol more afraid than any threat could have. "Yes," Kethrol admitted, "because killing you would be easy," the human said. "And we are not interested in easy anymore." They took him to a camp hidden deep in the mountains, a place that should not have existed according to hegemony intelligence. And they put him in a small room with a bed and a chair and a window that looked out over a valley so beautiful it made his chest ache. They fed him food that was strange but not unpleasant. They treated his wounds with care and skill, and then they began to talk to him different. Humans came to his room over the following days, soldiers and farmers and teachers and healers, and they asked him questions about his life and his world and his reasons for fighting. They wanted to know about his family and his childhood and the things he believed in. They wanted to understand him. Kethrol did not know how to respond to this. In all his years of service, he had never been asked such questions by anyone, not his superiors and certainly not his enemies. And the experience was so disorienting that he found himself answering honestly simply because he did not know what else to do. He told them about his homeworld and its purple skies and the way the light looked at sunset. He told them about his parents who had died when he was young and the uncle who had raised him to be a soldier. He told them about the doubts he had carried since the early days of the invasion and the report he had submitted and the way High Command had dismissed his warnings. The humans listened to everything he said, and they did not mock him or threaten him or try to use his words against him. They just listened. On the 5th day of his captivity, a human female came to his room and sat in a chair across from his bed and looked at him with eyes that held no hatred. "We are going to release you," she said. Kethrol stared at her. "Why?" he asked. "Because you are not our enemy," she said. "Not really. You are just a soldier following orders like soldiers everywhere. And we have learned that killing soldiers does not end wars. It just creates more soldiers." She leaned forward. "We want you to carry a message back to your commanders," she said. "Tell them that we are willing to negotiate. Tell them that we do not want this war to continue any more than they do. Tell them that there is still a chance for this to end without more death." She paused. "But also tell them this," she continued. "If they do not negotiate, if they continue to fight, then we will not stop until every single one of you is gone from our world. And we will follow you back to your homeworld, and we will show your species what happens to those who try to conquer humanity." Her voice was quiet, but there was something beneath the words that made Kethrol's blood run cold. "This is not a threat," she said. "This is a promise, and humans keep their promises." They released him the next morning with supplies and map and the message burning in his mind. He made his way back to hegemony territory, and he delivered the message exactly as he had been told to deliver it. His commanders listened. And then they laughed. They doubled the forces in the eastern territories. They launched new offensives across the planet. They ignored everything he had said. 3 months later, Kethril stood on the observation deck of a hegemony cruiser and watched something that should have been impossible. Human ships were rising from the surface of the planet. Vessels built from stolen technology and salvaged materials and the pure, stubborn determination of a species that refused to accept defeat. They were crude and ugly, and they should not have been able to fly, but they flew, and as Kethril watched them climb toward the stars, he understood that the war had entered a new phase. The humans were no longer content to fight on their own world. They were bringing the war to the hegemony, and they were just getting started. 4 years since the invasion began, and the hegemony armada was running. Kethril stood on the bridge of the carrier ship Dominant Will, the same vessel that had brought him to this world so long ago, and watched the tactical display with eyes that had seen too much death to feel anything but exhaustion. The display showed the positions of what remained of the hegemony fleet, a scattered collection of damaged ships that had once numbered in the thousands, and now could barely fill a single screen. It also showed the human fleet, growing larger every day as more ships rose from the surface, and more captured hegemony vessels were repaired and turned against their former owners. The conquest of Earth had become the greatest military disaster in 10,000 years of hegemony history, and it was about to get worse. High Command had ordered one final offensive, a desperate attempt to break through Earth's orbital defenses and destroy the shipyards where new human vessels were being built every day. They had dared every ship that could still fly and every soldier that could still fight, and they had committed everything to this one last battle. If they won, they might salvage something from this catastrophe. If they lost, there would be nothing left. Kethril had been promoted again, this time to the position of strategic advisor, which meant his job was to tell the fleet commanders things they did not want to hear. He had told them that this offensive would fail. He had told them that the humans had spent 4 years preparing for exactly this moment. He had told them that the hegemony should accept whatever terms the humans offered and withdraw before there was nothing left to withdraw. They had not listened. They never listened. The battle began at dawn according to Earth time. Hundreds of hegemony ships descending on the orbital defenses in a wave of fire and fury that lit up the sky like a second sun. For the first hour, it seemed like High Command might have been right. The human defenses bent under the assault, their makeshift stations and converted freighters struggling to hold back the hegemony tide. And Kethril watched the tactical display and allowed himself to hope that maybe this time would be different. Then the humans did something he had never seen before. They began broadcasting. Every screen on every ship in the hegemony fleet suddenly filled with images from the battle. Not propaganda or threats or demands for surrender, but raw, unedited footage of what was happening in the space above Earth. Kethril saw human ships burning, their hulls torn open, and their crews dying in the cold vacuum of space. He saw human soldiers fighting in the corridors of damaged stations, holding back hegemony boarding parties with weapons that were running out of power and bodies that were running out of blood. He saw a human medical ship taking hits meant for a combat vessel, its crew choosing to die so that the fighters beside them could live. And he realized that the humans were not broadcasting to their own people. They were broadcasting to the hegemony. Every world in the empire that could receive a signal was watching this battle, watching the humans fight and die and refuse to give up no matter how bad the odds became. The resistance movements that had been growing on a dozen conquered planets were watching. The species that had been whispering about rebellion for generations were watching. Everyone was watching, and then the moment came that Kethral would remember for the rest of his life. The hegemony flagship, a massive vessel called the Eternal Dominion, had broken through the outer defenses and was moving toward the main shipyard, its weapons charging for the killing blow that would end the human space program before it truly began. A single human destroyer moved to intercept. It was a small ship, barely larger than a shuttle, and it had already taken damage that should have left it drifting dead in space, but it was still flying. The destroyer's commander was a human female named Sarah Chun, and Kethral learned her name because she broadcasted along with everything else, along with her face and her voice and her final message to the fleet. "This is Captain Sarah Chun of the destroyer Hope's Promise," she said, and her voice was calm, even though fire was spreading through her bridge and half her crew was already dead. "I am moving to intercept the enemy flagship. All ships continue the defense. Do not break formation for me." Kethral watched the tiny ship accelerate toward the Eternal Dominion. He watched the flagship's weapons try to track the destroyer and fail because it was moving too fast and too unpredictably. He watched Captain Chun's face on the screen as she gave her final orders, and then he heard something that broke him. She began to sing. It was a soft melody, a lullaby, and she sang it with tears streaming down her face and smoke filling her lungs and death seconds away. Later, Kethral would learn that she was singing to her daughter, a child of 6 years who was watching the broadcast from a shelter on the surface below. A little girl who would grow up without a mother because Sarah Chun had chosen to die so that her daughter could lie free. The destroyer hit the Eternal Dominion at full speed. The explosion was visible from the surface of Earth. The flagship broke apart in a shower of fire and debris. Its command staff killed instantly, its weapons silenced forever, and the hegemony fleet broke, not from the loss of one ship, not from tactical necessity, not from any rational calculation of victory and defeat. They broke because they finally understood what they were fighting. They had come to this world expecting to find another species to conquer, another population to enslave, another planet to add to their empire. Instead, they had found something that could not be conquered. They had found a species that would sacrifice everything, not because they wanted to die, but because they loved something more than they feared death. They have found humans. The retreat began within minutes, and it did not stop. Ships that had been fighting moments ago turned and fled toward open space, their crews no longer willing to face an enemy that would sing lullabies while ramming its ships into their flagships. The Hegemony Council convened an emergency session that night. Kethral was there, standing in the back of the chamber as the most powerful beings in the Empire argued about what to do. Some wanted to continue the war, to bring more ships from the core worlds, to crush the humans with overwhelming force. But others had seen the broadcasts. Others had watched Captain Chun sing to her daughter. Others had finally understood that this was a war the hegemony could not win. Not because they lacked the strength, but because the humans would never stop fighting no matter how much strength was brought against them. The vote was taken just before dawn. It was unanimous. For the first time in 10,000 years of conquest, the hegemony voted for unconditional withdrawal. For the first time in recorded history, the hegemony had lost. Kethral stood on the observation deck as the fleet began its long journey. Holmany watched Earth grow smaller in the viewport. He thought about Captain Sarah Chun and her lullaby. He thought about the old woman who had laughed in his interrogation room. He thought about all the humans he had met during 4 years of war. The farmers and soldiers and children who had fought with everything they had, and never once considered surrender, and he understood that he would carry this war with him for the rest of his life, not the battles or the strategies or the politics, but the memory of what humans were capable of when they had something worth fighting for. 30 years had passed since the war ended, and Kethralvan was old now. His scales had faded from deep blue to pale gray, and his joints ached when the weather changed, and his eyes were not as sharp as they had once been, but his mind was still clear, and his memories were still vivid, and he still dreamed about Earth. Almost every night, he lived on a neutral world called Tessith, a small planet on the edge of known space where refugees and exiles from a dozen species had built a community based on the simple principle that the past did not have to define the future. Kethral had come here after the war because he could not go home. The hegemony had fallen apart in the years following the defeat, its member species breaking away one by one as they realized that the empire that had ruled them for 10,000 years was not as invincible as they had been taught to believe. The humans had shown them that resistance was possible. The humans had shown them that even the mightiest power could be brought down, and so the hegemony had crumbled, not from conquest, but from the simple truth that once you stopped believing in something, it lost its power over you. Kethral had spent the decades since the war writing about what he had witnessed, filling hundreds of documents with his observations and memories, and reflections on a conflict that had changed everything he believed about the universe. His writings were banned in what remained of hegemony space, but they were read everywhere, else he had become something of a celebrity among the species that had won their freedom in the aftermath of the war. A voice that spoke honestly about what the hegemony had done and why it had failed. And now, on a morning like any other, he received a message that made him stop and stare at his console. For a long time, it was an invitation from Earth. The humans were hosting a memorial to mark the 30th anniversary of the wars, and they wanted him to speak. Kethral read the message again and again, looking for some trick or hidden meaning, some indication that this was not what it appeared to be. He found nothing. The humans simply wanted him to come. They wanted him to tell his story. He thought about refusing. He thought about all the reasons why he should not go back to that world, all the memories he had spent 30 years trying to understand, all the faces of the dead that still haunted his dreams. And then he thought about Captain Sarah Chun singing a lullaby to her daughter. He thought about the old woman laughing in the interrogation room. He thought about every human who had shown him something he had never expected to find in an enemy. He sent his acceptance that same day. The journey to Earth took 3 weeks, and Kethral spent most of it standing at the viewport watching the stars pass by. When the blue planet finally appeared in the distance, he felt his throat tighten with emotions he could not name. It looked the same as it had 30 years ago, blue and green and swirling with white clouds, peaceful and beautiful and full of life. But as his shuttle descended through the atmosphere, he saw the differences. The cities that had been destroyed in the war had been rebuilt, not as copies of what came before, but as something new. Towers and domes and structures that reached toward the sky with a confidence that spoke of a species that had faced extinction and emerged stronger. The memorial was held in a vast garden that had once been a battlefield. Kethral walked through rows of monuments and sculptures and walls inscribed with names, millions of names, both human and hegemony, because the humans had chosen to remember everyone who had died, not just their own. He met survivors from both sides, former enemies who shared meals and stories, and sometimes tears. He met the children of those who had fought, young humans and young hegemony members, who had grown up hearing about the war but had never known its violence firsthand. He met Chen Mei, the daughter of Captain Sarah Chun, now a woman in her 30s with her mother's eyes and her mother's smile. She took his hand and thanked him for coming and told him that she had read everything he had written about the war. "My mother would have liked you," she said. She always believed that understanding was more important than revenge. Catherall could not speak for a long moment. When the time came for his speech, he stood at a podium before a crowd of thousands, humans and aliens together, and he looked out at their faces and felt the weight of everything he wanted to say pressing down on him. He did not talk about strategy or politics or the Medjugorje rise and fall of empires. He talked about people. He talked about the farmer who burned his crops rather than feed his enemies. He talked about the children who carried weapons through tunnels beneath their homes. He talked about the doctor who healed by day and fought by night. He talked about Captain Sarah Chun and her lullaby. "I came to your world as a conqueror," he said. "I came believing that strength was the only thing that mattered, that the powerful had the right to rule the weak, that your species would fall like all the others had fallen." He paused and looked at the faces before him. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about everything." He spoke about the war and what it had taught him, about the persistence and the adaptation and the absolute refusal to accept defeat that he had witnessed in every human he had ever met. He spoke about the fear he had felt when he finally understood that the hegemony could not win, not because it lacked power, but because power alone was not enough to break a species that would rather die than kneel. And then he spoke about what came after. "I have seen humans at their worst," he said. "I have seen you burn and kill and destroy in ways that would break any other species I have ever known." He looked at the memorial around him, the gardens and the monuments and the walls of names. "But I have also seen this," he said. "I have seen you remember your enemies alongside your heroes. I have seen you invite the one who tried to conquer you to speak at your memorial. I have seen you choose forgiveness when hatred would have been easier." His voice grew quiet. "That is what I will never forget," he said. "Not the violence, not the war, not the battles that killed so many on both sides." He looked at Chen Mei in the crowd and saw tears on her face. "What I will never forget is this," he said. "Humans are capable of anything. Absolutely anything, the best and the worst, the beautiful and the terrible." He spread his arms to encompass the garden and the crowd and the blue sky above, and again, "You choose to be kind." After the speech, an old woman approached him. She was small. A woman approached him. She was small and approached him. She was small and frail, and she walked with a cane that tapped against the garden path with each step. Catherall recognized her immediately, even though 30 years had passed. It was the resistance leader he had interrogated in that small room so long ago. The one who had laughed at him and told him that he did not understand what the hegemony had done. She reached up and took his hand in both of hers and held it tight. "You finally understand," she said. Catherall nodded because his voice would not work. They stood together in silence for a long moment. Two old enemies who had become something else, something that had no name but felt like peace. Later that evening, Catherall walked through the memorial gardens alone. He watched human children running and playing among the monuments, their laughter filling the air where screams had once echoed. He watched parents teaching their children the names on the walls, passing down the memory of those who had died so that they could live. He watched the sun set over a world that had been burned and broken and rebuilt into something beautiful, and he thought about everything he had witnessed in his long life, the conquests and the wars and the fall of the empire he had served. He thought about what humans were capable of, the destruction and the creation, The hatred and the love, the violence, and the forgiveness. He thought about Captain Sarah Chun singing a lullaby to her daughter in the last moments of her life. He thought about Chen Mei thanking him for his words. He thought about the old woman taking his hand and telling him that he finally understood, and he knew that he would carry this with him until the day he died, not as a burden but as a gift. The knowledge that somewhere in this vast and often cruel universe there existed a species that could be anything and chose again and again to be kind. I survived the war, but I will never forget what humans are capable of.